Europe without Russia unavoidably becomes a Europe against Russia. This is when the Americans began to speak of Pax Americana, which was, referring to Pax Romana, which is a peace through American dominance. First of all, let's say this is good that people of Bulgaria has a good view of Russia. I mean, hating entire nations is something quite disgusting. Everyone should be a part of Europe except for the largest country in Europe, which is Russia. The only thing we talk about is how many American bases can we fit in Norway. I guess the predictable path would be that once they push the Russians out, NATO would move in and take over this Black Sea fleet in Crimea. Then we're telling the Russians, either you take Odessa now, or it will end up in the hands of NATO. NATO ran out of weapons to send, and the Trump administration knows this. If you want to save Ukraine, you have to make a deal now. Now, the Arctic corridor is interesting because it's faster, it's cheaper, and it's not within control of the US Navy. I think Europe has to accept the reality. We don't have the money, we don't have the military, so what exactly are we doing?
Hello to all of the followers of the channel Rational Resistance. Today I'm going to have a conversation with Professor Glen Dizen, and I'm glad that he accepted our invitation. Just to show, this is his book that appeared in Bulgarian, The War in Ukraine and the Eurasian World Order. This is the book. It was published last year. I think it's selling very good in Bulgaria. And there is a sense in this, because your estimation is very realistic, in my opinion, and I think that we need more such estimations of the conflict, because the propaganda is very strong, I would say.
I appreciate the invitation, and I'm also very happy to see that the book was translated into Bulgarian, and also doing well there. And may I just say, I agree with the sentiment that the misinformation and indeed propaganda around this war has become a key problem. Indeed, I spoke recently with the former CIA director of Russia analysis, and he made the same point. They argued that the West, we have essentially trapped ourselves within this propaganda narrative. So I think some discussions around this is very important.
Just a few words about you for the people that don't know. You're a Norwegian political scientist and also professor of the University of Southeastern Norway. That's right?
Yes, that's correct.
And also, of course, expert in geopolitics and the role of Russia today. And this is very important because not so many people are really so deeply involved in this topic. But in your book, you speak about the Westphalian peace treaties. Can you say in a nutshell, because it's a whole book, of course, what are the dimensions of the Westphalian treaties nowadays?
Well, very briefly, what the Westphalian system was, it was a response to the 30-year war. That is, at the time, we saw the power of the Holy Roman Empire as a hegemonic center of power. It dissolved largely because of the Reformation, but also because it was reflected in a new distribution of power. So anyways, went from a hegemonic peace where there's only one center of power, and then suddenly you had a lot of different centers of power beginning to compete in Europe. And a long story short, we were slaughtering each other for 30 years from 1618 to 1648. And it was finally resolved with the Peace of Westphalia. Now, Peace of Westphalia essentially laid out the idea that peace wouldn't depend on having one dominant state, but having many centers of power, which would then respect each other's security. And if one state was expansionist, tried to assert dominance, then the others would collectively balance that expansionist state. And this kind of formed the foundation for the European system. But given that Europe was, well, let's say, the center of the world, at least is where the past 500 years the Europeans have been at the forefront, it also laid the foundation for world order. Well, it defines the modern world order for the past 500 years, so it's quite an important system. So whenever we talk about the Westphalian peace or the Westphalian system, then we essentially talk about the foundation of modern world order, which is this several great powers, and peace functions through a balance of dependence, and the state is sovereign. So this is, in a nutshell, I guess.
Yeah, so everything is still based on this order.
It was, because until somewhat recently, that is, when we saw that the amount of great powers gradually reduced for many reasons. One of them was the relevance for dominating the seas, But in the Cold War, we ended up finally with two. And then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was only one great power left. And this is when the Americans began to speak of Pax Americana, which was, referring to Pax Romana, which is a peace through American dominance, which again could have had good intentions. So you want a stable international system where the great powers don't compete because there's only one. And this one great power also argued to advance liberal democratic values. So it would create a more benign international system. This was the logic. But overall, this was a challenge to the entire Westphalian system because there could only be one center of power. And this was outlined already in February 1992. You had this leak of the strategic documents, which became known as the Wolfowitz Doctrine, where the US had to ensure that all peace would depend on there only being one center of power. And for this reason, even the rise of Germany and Japan would be very problematic. I argue that this system was destined to be temporary because it depends on holding down, preventing the rise of rivals, and it becomes very expensive. So over time, that is, if you look from the 90s, it was very predictable that over time, the US would exhaust itself, it would take on too much debt, it would delegitimize itself, and then you would have new rivals emerging at the periphery. So be it Russia, China, India, or whoever it would be, and they would then seek to collectively balance the US simply because of its hegemonic ambitions. And this is effectively how we see now the return to the normal, which is this short period of time, 3 decades, of American hegemony, or Pax Americana, which is done now, and we're returning to a multipolar Westphalian world order.
What is happening actually right now? Before delving into the conflict of Ukraine as the main topic, what is happening there, I would like to ask you something which is probably a bit more personal. I don't know your stance against Russia and the roots of it, because, for example, here in Bulgaria, it's very typical to love Russia or to like Russia because we have a common cultural heritage. We are Orthodox together. We gave them even the alphabet, of course, more than 1,000 years ago. The Slavonic Church of Slavonic is actually all Bulgarian.
Well, first of all, let's say this is good that people of Bulgaria has a good view of Russia. I mean, hating entire nations is something quite disgusting, which we shouldn't really have. Unfortunately, it become normalized. But also, if you want economic prosperity, political stability, and avoid conflict, then probably getting along with the largest country in Europe in terms of economy, population, territory, and military is a good idea. Doesn't mean to subordinate, but it does mean not hating and recognizing commonality. Indeed, I think one of the key problems we have in Europe is that after the Cold War, we had this idea that let's create a Europe without Russia. Everyone should be a part of Europe except for the largest country in Europe, which is Russia. So I think this predictably led to conflict because a Europe without Russia unavoidably becomes a Europe against Russia. And I think this is where we are. So not hating a country and liking it is positive. I think we should have good reasons why we should like Russia, Ukraine, Bulgaria, Germany. Once we start hating nations, it's very bad. But over to my country, Norway. It's interesting because, just as you look at the geography, it's very thin, long country. And the historical memories are quite different because up in the north, we have a shared border with Russia. So there's more people-to-people contacts. And also during the Second World War, we were occupied by Nazi Germany. And the Red Army actually came across and liberated the northern parts of the country, that is Finnmark. And, the Russians buried their dead and then they went home. But what's fascinating is, so up in north, they actually have some good memories of Russia. They remember cooperation. They have more, again, people-to-people contact across the border. However, in the south, in the capital, Oslo, we adopted a NATO narrative. That is, we say in history, well, the Soviets never liberated anyone. They just pushed out the fascists and then replaced them in the occupation. So this is effectively the historical memory of Poland, for example. And again, I'm not going to belittle the historical experience of Poland. They suffered greatly under the Nazi occupation, and they also suffered under the Soviet occupation or tutelage or vassalization, or whatever you want to call it, the heavy hand of Moscow, they have good reasons to have some resentment towards this, not just on the Soviet Union, but the Russian Empire before it. But my point is, it's quite interesting in Oslo that we adopted essentially the Polish historical memory, because for us, the Russians came, they liberated, and then they left. So we don't have this historical memory. But again, in NATO, you have to more or less embrace the common narratives, and so this is what we're doing. So, no, I really don't know why it's become a very, I think, an aggressive policy towards Russia, and in this country we treat being hostile towards Russia as being it's an indication of how loyal you are to Norway, or how if you're trustworthy. But my point is, security never depended on being aggressive towards neighbors. Indeed, if you want peace with your neighbor, you do not provoke them. This is the point of departure in all security studies. You want to mitigate or reduce the security competition. So for Norway, during the Cold War, we were part of NATO, which was meant to deter the Soviets, but we did not allow foreign bases on our soil. We didn't want the British and Americans to be too active in our high north along the Soviet border. So we wanted to deter, but also reassure that we weren't being aggressive. So we became kind of NATO light, and this was seen as a balancing for optimal approach to security. This is all gone today. The only thing we talk about is how many American bases can we fit in Norway? Let's have more activity up in the north. Everything's deterrence. But if you only look at deterrence without the reassurance, then you're not going to enhance your own security. But again, I think the underlying problem, at least we have in this country, is we don't discuss Russian security concerns. And if you don't discuss the Russian security concern, how can you possibly even dream of reducing the security competition? So everything is just deter as much as possible. And this is so dangerous, because if you believe that more weapons creates more peace, then you really need to look up any history book, because this is just a bit of an absurd approach to international security.
Yeah, unfortunately, in Bulgaria, in the government, we have the same preposterous narrative, although the population is against it. And speaking of Russia's security concerns, what do you think about Russia in the security architecture? Will they really need, for example, to take Odessa for their goals?
For their goals?
Yeah.
Well, it depends. It could end up this way. But it's worth noting that before 2014, Russia didn't lay any claim at all to any Ukrainian territory, not even Crimea. Even the most anti-Russian hawks in America also recognized this. People like McFaul, who said, yes, no, this was a reaction to the removal of Yanukovych. So we have to address, well, why? What sparked this? Because whether or not anyone agrees with it, or how the Russians saw it, is with the toppling of Yanukovych, with the backing of Western governments, the main goal was to pull Ukraine into NATO's orbit. And this meant to expel them from their Black Sea fleet base in Sevastopol in Crimea. And this was seen as a replay of the Crimean War in the 1850s, that is, push Russia out of the Black Sea. And I guess the predictable path would be that once they pushed the Russians out, NATO would move in and take over this Black Sea fleet in Crimea. So the first thing the Russians did was to take Crimea Peninsula, which they hadn't laid any claim to only a few weeks earlier. So it is quite remarkable. Now, I mentioned this because we have to address, what's going to happen to Odessa. And my point is simply, if you have a neutral Ukraine, then the Russians can afford to have Ukraine keep Odessa. Indeed, I would hope that Ukraine does keep Odessa. Otherwise, it will become a landlocked country. It will be very difficult for it to develop economically. However, if we want Ukraine to keep Odessa, then we have to be a bit careful what we're signaling to the Russians. Because if we're saying after the war, Ukraine will join NATO, either as a de facto member or an actual member, then we're telling the Russians, either you take Odessa now, or it will end up in the hands of NATO. If the Russians have the option of having the historical town or historical city of Odessa in the hands of NATO or return to Russia, then they will take it. And indeed, it's a very strategic territory on the Black Sea. However, if we're willing to say to the Russians, okay, let's reduce the security competition. NATO doesn't take Odessa, Russia doesn't take Odessa, Ukraine will restore its neutrality. now it can remain a part of Odessa. So whenever we want to express solidarity with the Ukrainians, we always say, yes, you will join NATO after the war. Again, it sounds so very moral and supporting, but what we're actually sending is a very clear signal and incentive to the Russians. That is, you better take Odessa now before we take it. This is a very dangerous signal, and I wish there would be more rational discussion around this topic.
Probably, if the Ukrainians agree to leave the already annexed territories, they will not lose more. Is that the logic? And if they don't agree and if they continue to fight, they can use more. That was probably the case when we had the peace negotiations in Turkey.
This is why the Trump administration is also looking and saying that we need a deal with the Russians and we need it fast, because they recognize that on the battlefield, the Ukrainian army is collapsing. So the Europeans, they seem to think the alternative is either make a deal now or we continue to fight Russia for send more weapons and put the Ukraine in a better position at, negotiation table in, 4 or 5 years from now. But the reality is Ukraine will collapse. The army is completely exhausted. They run out of manpower. The NATO ran out of weapons to send. And the Trump administration knows this. So the alternative is either negotiate now, a deal which is not good for Ukraine at all. Don't get me wrong. I think this is a terrible deal. They lost a lot of men. They will lose about 20% of their territory. It's a horrible deal. But the alternative is a collapse. And if there's a collapse and Russia doesn't trust in a political settlement, it also means that NATO has to commit itself to stop its pushing to Ukraine. And if it collapses because NATO doesn't want to accept this, then Russia will effectively seize all the territory after Ukrainian collapse, which it can't allow NATO to use as a front line against it. So it's I agree. I think if you want to save Ukraine, you have to make a deal now. I think this is a very crucial moment. I will, give benefit of doubt to people who said that have the best intentions or the best, in mind for Ukraine. They need to have an honest look at where Ukraine actually is and what is the best alternative. Because to just resist any peace now, it's just going to end up in a horrible situation. They don't have any good cards to play anymore. If they keep doubling down, the losses in terms of men and territory is going to be so much worse.
Yeah, but at the same time, we have the European Union and the politicians that are in power that are pushing forward the war. And they're obviously rejecting diplomacy. They really don't want to have those negotiations. They somehow imagine probably that Moscow will fall in their hands. I don't know. It's very delusional, of course. But what will happen if the European Union continues with those narratives?
What the Trump administration was able to do was when they got when they cut off the military aid and intelligence to Ukraine. The reason why is because they were able to get Ukraine to accept the premise of a ceasefire. Now, this was just the first step. There's never been have a ceasefire without any political deal. It doesn't make any sense. It would fall apart immediately. So, but this was seen as a step towards further negotiations. So I think they're moving down this path now. If the Europeans would resist it and seek to sabotage it by, for example, insisting on having European troops within Ukraine, I think at some point the Americans will just wash their hands of this because they don't want to be part of it. They will probably say, if you want to fight the Russians, go ahead. That's your, funeral. We're going to pull out. And so I think Europe has to accept the reality. We don't have the money. We don't have the military. So what exactly are we doing? It's, just beating your chest when it's not backed up by any actual power or any strategy. It's extremely irresponsible. I mean, so far, we've just been fighting with the Ukrainians. But if we continue down this path, we're also going to fight with our own soldiers. And, we're already destroying our own economies. So I don't think we're doing ourselves any favors. We're not doing Ukraine any favors. I've been a bit perplexed by Europe's stance as well. Because if you remember back to 2008, when that fateful decision was made to promise future NATO membership to Ukraine and Georgia, the Europeans were pushing back. Angela Merkel called it a declaration of war against Russia. You had ambassadors from Germany, France revealed in WikiLeaks that they expected this could trigger a civil war for good reasons. A lot of this was predictable. But now the Americans were able to pull along the Europeans into this confrontation with the Russians. And now that the war has been lost, the Americans are pulling out. and leaving the huge mess for the Europeans. And the Europeans seem a bit overly eager to take over this mess. It's a very strange. It doesn't make any sense, really, if you look at it. Take a step back from a strategic lens.
Yeah, the main problem is probably that we have European politicians like Kaja Kallas, Macron, Starmer, even Ursula von der Leyen, that are really obsessed with the idea of defeating Russia. And they are even speaking about decolonization, that Russia has all of those ethnic minorities and we have to defederalize Russia. So with those politicians, what will be the future of NATO if they really continue with this story?
Well, I think this is the problem, and this is why I think the narratives have been such an important part of this war. It's because it's not just what's happening on the battlefield, it's the construction of narratives as well, because the purpose of a lot of these narratives, which the Europeans always push for conformity around, is they're constructed to make war the only solution and make peace impossible. So, for example, the key narrative was from day one said, this was unprovoked. And because once you say that war is unprovoked, then any negotiations with Russia is just appeasement. And that's why the Europeans only, live perpetually in 1938, that any diplomacy is like another deal with Hitler. And this is it's quite absurd. But if we did recognize that this was provoked, then at least we could discuss some of the source of this war, which is, perhaps we need to discuss what we never had after the Cold War, that is a mutually acceptable post-Cold War solution. Because if you remember in the 1990s, when we decided to expand NATO instead of constructing a common Europe with the Russians, even among the political elites in the United States, such as Clinton's Secretary of Defense, they threatened to leave their position because they said this is a betrayal of Russia. This is essentially restarting the logic of the Cold War. We shouldn't be doing this. And everyone just said, well, it doesn't really matter what the Russians think. They're weak. So this was the main setup for European security architecture. Just NATO would be so powerful that it didn't have to take into account Russian security concern. Madeleine Albright said the same thing. She was very for NATO expansion. And she said, well, if it doesn't work out with Russia, at least we'll have a very powerful NATO there, which would then be circling Russia. So this is what we have today. And so I'm not saying that any of this legitimizes the Russian invasion of Ukraine, anything like this. I'm just saying we have to address some of the sources of this conflict. And if we can do this, then it's possible to find a peace and to find a compromise. Because what the Russians were suggesting is not unreasonable. Indeed, what they've been talking about for the past 30 years is to not have a hegemonic system in Europe, but one that also takes into account Russia. It's very reasonable. So if we can just go to this, if we can reduce the threat to Russia, they don't have to respond in such a manner. But there's no possibility of even doing this. As you said, the political class in Europe has gone completely off the rails. They think they're fighting Hitler. They're so aggressive. And as you said, what is peace when you're fighting Hitler? Well, we established peace summits where we don't invite the Russians. We don't talk about their security. Instead, you have people like at the peace summit in Switzerland, where President Duda of Poland says, Russia is a prison for nations. There's 200 nations there who should be liberated. And as you also pointed out, Kaja Kallas also, it's good if we can defeat Russia, because then it can be broken up to smaller countries, and then it would be much better, she said. So if this is peace, we have to deal with the fact that our political leaders have, to a large extent, become very aggressive and only looking at possibility of peace by defeating your opponent. And when your opponent is the world's largest nuclear power, it's not the best idea in the world.
Yeah, also she said that she will never negotiate with war criminals, which is, and how will you then overcome the problem and the situation? But there is also another key element. You spoke about it, not here in other places, but the Russophobia. And this is something very common also, but how did it spread? I mean, if we think in terms of propaganda, how does it work really? How are they implementing Russophobia in the societies, in the Western societies?
Well, I think the Russophobia simply refers to as irrational hatred or fear of Russia. I think the hatred is quite obvious now. My argument is a direct consequence of propaganda, because propaganda often tends to appeal to the irrational. If you look at the West's history with Russia, they always played our opposite, our opponent, because in human nature, we organize in groups. Instinctively, we look at who is the in-group, who is the out-group, and propaganda entails assigning effectively political identities to who we are versus them. Now, historically, this was Europeans were the civilized, East was the barbarians, we were the Europeans, the Russians were seen as Asiatics because of their Mongol occupation. It was very ethnic, to be honest, all the way until World War II. And then you saw a shift in the propaganda because then ideology kicked more in. Then it was more communism versus capitalism. And after the Cold War, we revived this. Now it's liberal democracy versus authoritarianism. Now, obviously, there's always an element of, yes, of course, we have more liberalism than they have in Russia, but to reduce all conflicts down to this very simplistic, dumbed down heuristics that, yes, this is it. I mean, it's very problematic. It's propagandistic because it's a way of always dividing the world into good versus evil or superior versus inferior. And that's what we always do. And it's very damaging because we're not unpacking any of the complexity. And there's no room for self-criticism, because why would the civilized accept criticism in a struggle against the barbaric ones? So, and this is what we see now. And indeed, after Russia invaded in 2022, for a very brief moment, Macron was looking if there was any way to have any political settlement. He even said to the Europeans, perhaps, we should also address Russian security concerns. This was his final plea. And he was effectively shut down by the Europeans, saying, how dare you? These are the barbaric invaders. How are we going to, look at their security? We should look at the security of the victims. So everything is good versus evil. And when everything is good versus evil, there's no conceptual space for even discussing the security concerns of your opponents.
Yeah, there is only one opinion that is ruling over everything, and this is very undemocratic, and this is the main problem, probably. It's a pure hypocrisy. But there is another question that I would like to ask you, and it concerns also Bulgaria, not directly, but also directly in a way, the relation between Russia and Turkey. Because now, with the slow collapsing of the European Union, here in the Balkans, we are coming back to the 19th century in a way, the Eastern question. And what is the real relation right now between Turkey and Russia, and how do you see it will develop in the future?
Well, when the world becomes more multipolar, it's an opportunity for many small and medium-sized states to get more political autonomy. Let's say a country like Turkey, when the world is only bipolar, you're forced to either align with East or West. When it's unipolar, again, America's the only game in town. You more or less adjust. In a multipolar system, a country like Turkey can begin to diversify its economic connectivity. So the main objective for Turkey has been link itself, close still to the US, to the EU, but also to Russia, China, and other centers of power. Because only by diversifying your economic connectivity can you then obtain sufficient political autonomy as well, which is why why Turkey is taking a very independent position. Now, does that mean its independent position is always nice and peaceful? I would say no. There's no indication of this. They have their flaws like all other countries. They can do some good, they can do some bad, but overall their main objective is to have more autonomy. And this is also a bit confusing to people in the West, because we only remember unipolarity and the Cold War with bipolarity. So if Turkey is not aligning with NATO's position, then we're assuming, well, then they have gone over to the Chinese, they've gone over to the Russians. And then we have this emotional roller coaster where it's like, oh, now he's turning on Putin again. Oh, no, now he's back with Putin. But the thing is, the Turks aren't looking to decide which block they should fall into. They don't want a block, because once you put yourself in a block, it means you have complete obedience to one center of power while you cut yourself off from others. So this is not what they want. They want diversification. So they want to work with Russia, EU, US, all of them to the extent it helps and is in Turkish interest. So I think Turkey and Russia is interesting. On one hand, the Russians look at Turkey and they appreciate the fact that they have some independent policy, which if you look at Europe, the conformity there is very dangerous, as you pointed out. The conformity to these crazy narratives where Russia is a new Hitler. I mean, it's very stupid as well. So it's good that the Turks are able to formulate an independent foreign policy. Indeed, in Europe, we outsource our foreign policy to the US so long we don't have any strategic thinking left. From the Russian perspective, they look at Turkey that their interest historically has often been at odds with Russia. And this is why at times they will have a bit of a clash. Also, the Russians, they see, I think, Erdogan as being perhaps a bit deceptive, thinking then of how he released the Azov fighters, which he promised he wouldn't do until the end of the war. The attacks on Syria, removing Assad. I think there's a lot of activities which that Russia sees Erdogan as having deceived them and not always being trustworthy. So again, it's not either or. I think they appreciate the independent position, but they wish the independent position would be more reliable, I guess.
Yeah, they also help Ukraine with drones and all of that stuff. But more straightforwardly than the question, do you think that neo-Osmanic ambitions could lead to inevitable clash with Russia? Especially around the Black Sea, there are many interests there and historically many wars between them.
It could happen. Again, there's a lot of conflicting interests often. You see this they find themselves on opposite side in Libya. They find themselves on the opposite side in Syria. Also, of course, Azerbaijan with the incursion into Nagorno-Karabakh and wider Armenia. So there's always room for having more conflicts. But at the same time, I think Turkey wouldn't want NATO and the US and all to become, I guess, too pushy into the Black Sea either. So I think having this a bit of a balance between Russia and Turkey, it also works for them. Also, I don't think anyone in Turkey thinks that that they're going to come for Istanbul or anything, because a lot of the 19th century conflicts derived from also, well, not just Russia pursuing more access to reliable maritime corridors by expanding them south through Bulgaria as well, but also the dream of retaking Constantinople, making Russia the capital of Christianity effectively. A lot of this is, no one's discussing this. This is long gone. So I don't think we're going to go back to the 19th century in terms of the conflicts. But no, I tend to be optimistic about the ability of Turkey and Russia to not end up in conflict, but it is a challenge given that they're on opposite sides almost all the time.
Probably as last question that could be developed, what is happening in Greenland and the politics of Trump? What is the Norwegian relation, so to say, to this idea of Trump?
Well, in short, I think Greenland is primarily about the Arctic and natural resources. And again, half the Arctic coastline is Russia. The other 7 Arctic states are NATO countries. So traditionally, Russia wanted to develop the Arctic with Western countries, but this was back in the days when it pursued inclusive Greater Europe, that is inclusive security architecture. After 2014, it gave up on this, and it instead began to pursue modernization and economic development by aligning with countries in the East. So again, this Greater Eurasian Initiative. Now, this has also implications for the Arctic, because at the moment, not only are all the other countries NATO countries, but also the NATO countries have suspended all cooperation in the Arctic Council. The relations are quite poor. They don't see them becoming better in the foreseeable future. So Russia is seeking to make it more of an Eastern project, inviting China, India, and other countries to develop Arctic with them. Now, this is all happening at the same time as the Arctic is actually gaining relevance, because in the past, there wasn't that many strategic interests. Now there's 2 key strategic interests now, at least competing strategic interests in the Arctic. And one is a transportation corridor that, as the US is always thought, just like the British before them, to dominate the main maritime corridors for global dominance. Now the Arctic corridor is interesting because it's faster, it's cheaper, and it's not within the control of the U.S. Navy. So this is seen as being problematic, as Pompeo was very explicit. He does not care for this at all. And the second is the natural resources, the oil, gas, gold, diamonds, rare earth minerals, effectively everything we want. This is a huge source of resources which can fuel economic development for decades and decades to come. So we're seeing now the Arctic becoming a huge region for strategic competition, and at the same time we see the Arctic being now divided between the bloc of 7 NATO countries versus Russia, who has half the Arctic coast. So this is why it's intensifying, and this is why also the Americans would like to get their hands on Greenland. It has a lot of natural resources. It reassures a lot of access into the Arctic. Of course, this would end Denmark's position as an Arctic state, given that their ticket to the Arctic is through their ownership of Greenland. But I think overall it's not just Trump. I mean, Trump is more crude and aggressive and I guess vulgar in many ways, but the big shift we're seeing now is the end of unipolarity. And as we're done with bipolarity and unipolarity, and we're going to multipolarity now, the interests of the Europeans and Americans will shift more and more. So this idea that we're one political community, it's going to come to an end irrespective of who sits in the White House. And it's through this prism, I think it's worth noting that the Americans would they would like to control a lot of these things themselves. So give us the Arctic, and I think this is the direction they're going anyways. So the Americans will have few resources. They will shift their strategic focus to the Western Hemisphere and Asia, and demand more from the Europeans. They want more economic, political loyalties. So this is why we're going to have some divisions and clash, and this is why they prefer to take these strategic territories for themselves.
Thank you for this conversation. I believe another book written by you is being translated in Bulgarian right now. This is the previous one that was translated. The people can buy it. It's a very good book. And I'm looking forward also for another conversations with you in a few months. I'm really glad that we can have such an at least tending to objectivity conversation. And also thank you once more for all of your opinions and the way you express them.
Thank you so much.